For our DMU students that are here, you are quite familiar with our speaker this afternoon. So it doesn't need much of an introduction for you, but for those who might not know Dr. Huff, I'm going to take a few minutes to introduce our speaker. Of course, I'm Angela Franklin, the 15th president of Des Moines University, and honored to serve now for 5 years as the president and CEO. This has been quite a journey for us to get to the culminating event for our history launch. Of course, you know, a few weeks ago we started celebrating the publishing of the history of DMU, tracing our history back to the beginning with SS and Ella Steele's arrival in Des Moines. We are so pleased that you've been a part of this with us and excited to hear from Dr. Huff today. Dr. Gary Huff received the DO degree in 1977 from Oklahoma College of Osteopathic Medicine. Since that time, he has practiced medicine, been certified in internal medicine and cardiology, guided hospital clinical education programs, educated and mentored undergraduate medical students, and developed a passion for the humanities in medicine. In his 35 years in academic medicine, Dr. Huff estimates that he has been involved in the education of more than 6,000 medical students and counting. In 2014, about 200 of those students in the comm class of 2016 nominated Dr. Hoff for the Northrop Educator of the Year Award, based largely on his History of Medicine course and the Healer's Art elective. In both, he shared a great deal of knowledge on the art and science of medicine. Students are particularly fond of his quote, and I quote him, "Medicine is an art formed by science," end quote. And one student even imagined that Dr. Huff was a DMU present-day version of A.T. Still. What a thought. Today we are pleased to listen to Dr. Huff as he shares insights on a particular aspect of the history of medicine, that is, of the founding of our college. Dr. Huff.
Thank you, Dr. Franklin. Let me get these slides going and we'll talk. This college, or this university, the forerunner of this university, was founded in 1898. And the founding of this college was one of the harbingers of change in the osteopathic world. That sounds strange when I say that only 6 years after Andrew Taylor Still founded his American School of Osteopathy, things were already beginning to change, but in fact they were. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how this school came to be. To do that, I have to begin the story in Boston in 1897. January of 1897, early in the month, a businessman from Akron, Ohio, had traveled to Boston for some kind of business purposes. He suffered a paralytic stroke. He was paralyzed on his left side, could still speak, obviously, but he sought the advice of the medical men of Boston, then is now one of the centers of medical education in the United States. He sought several physicians' advice there, and unsatisfied with the answers that he received from them, look, you've had a stroke, you're paralyzed, nothing's going to make you better, he decided to get another opinion. And so, about 5 or 6 days after his stroke, he boarded a train and went to Kirksville, Missouri. The judge's name, the businessman's name, was Arthur Conger. And he sought the advice of this man, Andrew Taylor Still. A.T. Still is the founder of the profession of osteopathic medicine. In those days, though, it was known as osteopathy. And Still, by 1897, had become nationally, maybe even internationally famous. A.T. Still was known and backed by such prominent people as John D. Rockefeller, Mark Twain, Theodore Roosevelt, all of whom had lined up and said that Andrew Taylor Still's system of osteopathy was in fact the best and newest healing system on earth. Osteopathy begins with A.T. Still then. He came from a Methodist family. His father was a physician and a minister. His father had read medicine, as many did in the early 19th century, with a physician in Southwest Virginia, and then took his practice of medicine along with his circuit riding for the Methodist Church, and by the way, many Methodist circuit riders did this, so that he could go to these remote settlements and not only minister to their spiritual needs, but also to their physical ones. As a member of a Methodist family, A.T. was a lifelong teetotaler, no alcohol. Methodists held strongly against the use of spirits and powerful substances. There were also, the Still family, staunch abolitionists. And in fact, it was Abram, A.T.'s father, who was such a staunch abolitionist that at the time when the Methodist Episcopal Church of the United States underwent schism, which they did, Abram was basically out of a job because he was anti-slavery, and the major faction of the Methodists were pro-slavery. The bishop of the Methodist Church at that time was a slave owner. In any event, Abram and his family moved from Southwest Virginia, where A.T. was born, through Tennessee, and then eventually wound up in northern Missouri. A.T. was the third son. He had three older brothers. No, he had two older brothers. I'm thinking of his son. He had two twin sons. He had two older brothers, Edward and James. James received an MD degree from Northwestern. Edward got an MD degree somewhere, but I can't find out where. Andrew, or Drew as the family called him, he was always known as Drew, even when he was older. Drew did not attend a medical school, but in eastern Kansas, in Kansas Territory, in the 1850s, possibly beginning before that, but certainly beginning in the 1850s, Andrew read medicine with his father Abram. He also admitted in his autobiography years later that he dug up Indians' bodies to study for the anatomy. Interestingly, at least one of his biographers says that he had permission to do this. However, that's the only place I could find the source. Still himself seemed to sort of shamefacedly admit that he was stealing bodies. Well, eventually, as we'll see, he repudiated conventional therapy for a lot of reasons. Certainly the most important one was that the drugs of the time, while they were either toxic or ineffective in most cases. The toxic ones were terrible. Still mentions in his autobiography about receiving mercurial compounds in the form of calomel. And what they used to do, they would give people calomel and they called it salivating them. You would give them calomel until they couldn't stop frothing at the mouth, and then you knew you had given them enough. The problem with calomel is a mercurial compound. Anybody ever hear of the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland? The Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland had mercury poisoning. That's why he was mad. Hatters in those days, they used mercury to smooth down the hats, and they all absorbed tons of mercury, and they went nuts. It also made your teeth loose. Still talked about how he was salivated once as a child until some of his teeth fell out. These drugs were not nice drugs. So his departure from conventional medicine was stimulated by Methodism, one of the things that Methodists despised was the fact that many of the drugs available were dissolved in alcohol. So even if the drug didn't work, you were getting boozed up. Okay? So the Methodists didn't like drugs very much. I mentioned the harmful drugs and care of the time. It's one of the canonical stories of osteopathic history about Still's children. Most books say that Still's children, 3 of them died of spinal meningitis. Well, almost right. 2 died of spinal meningitis. 1 died of pneumonia. What had happened is Still had been married, and his first wife died in 1859 after a particularly troublesome childbirth. He married his second wife about a year later in 1860 and set up housekeeping there in eastern Kansas. He had 4 children from his first marriage, and then he and his second wife began to have children. 2 of the 3 children who died were from his first marriage. And the other was one of his children with his second wife, Mary Elvira. Now, he says in his autobiography that the problem that he had, besides the fact that the medicines weren't any good, was the fact that no one could save his children. He says that he sought the advice of medical men, all the medical men in the area where he lived around Baldwin, Kansas. None could provide him with any help for his children. It's hard for us to imagine these days, what with childhood mortality being so low, how this could have been for someone in those days. But consider this. By 1864, in the space of 5 years, he had lost a wife and 4 children. 1 had died after a particularly difficult childbirth. Consider that, to have had 5 deaths within a period of 5 years. Well, possibly as a reaction to those deaths, Still began to go a little off. This would have been at the end of the Civil War. He began to experiment and to look into spiritualism. Who knows what that is or was? Not many of you. Spiritualism was a system of belief in the late 19th century that said you can communicate with the dead. It was not just the idea that you could communicate with the dead, but it also had religious and spiritual leanings too. You can imagine what a staunch Methodist would have thought of this, right? But you can also understand how Still was, because he was so devastated by the loss of his children. That's where spiritualism took hold, is in people who were under severe stress and grief. He belonged to a spiritualist community probably for the ensuing from about 1870 until perhaps even his death. Now, if you read A.T. Still's biographies, they will tell you that he was read out, or if you're a Catholic, excommunicated from his Methodist congregation. According to at least one of the biographers, it was because they felt that he was too close to emulating Jesus by the laying on of hands, because by then he had already begun his drugless healing. However, this was in 1874. However, it's just as probable that he was read out owing to spiritualism. In fact, I would submit to you that that's probably the reason he was thrown out of the Methodist Church. At that same time, he began to talk about his healing system that he'd begun to look into. He had decided that the use of drugs was a fool's game, and that you weren't going to make people better, you were going to make them worse. And so he literally preached against the use of drugs, in favor of spiritualism, and he began to do these things like the Methodist minister didn't like, the laying on of hands. He had embraced a system of drugless healing called magnetic healing. Now, a word about that. Magnetic healing began in Europe. It began in the late 18th century, nearly a century before still, with the work of a man named Franz Mesmer. Franz Mesmer was a fraud. Mesmer moved from Eastern Europe to Paris, where he used to hold all kinds of gaudy meetings, and he would come in dressed in flowing robes, and there would be smoke and mirrors and things, and he would make people better by altering the aura around them. By the way, Still said he could do that too. And also by altering the magnetic fluid of the body. The French, this was around 1800, were appalled by this. In fact, the French authorities appointed a committee to investigate mesmerism, as it was called, and the committee thoroughly discredited this system of healing. One of the members of that committee was an American. His name was Benjamin Franklin. But somehow, although mesmerism was thoroughly discredited in Europe, it jumped the Atlantic and wound up in frontier America. Well, I think you can see how someone like A.T. Still, who had very little formal education, I don't suppose he finished 6th or 8th grade. You can see how someone who had a narrower education might embrace these things. Let's make somebody better. No drugs. So forth. So that from the mid-1870s until probably the mid-1880s, he was a magnetic healer. There were other magnetic healers around. One of the most famous, a few years after that, lived in Davenport. His name was Daniel David Palmer. He started another system of healing called chiropractic. Well, in the 1880s, though, and nobody knows exactly how this happened, Still began to call himself a, quote, lightning bone setter. Now, bone setting, in contrast to magnetic healing, while looked down upon by regular practitioners, orthodox physicians, was also known to provide real help and real relief. Bone setting was quasi-professional, but primarily was handed down in families. In this country, North America at least, there was a family by the last name of Sweet, mostly working on the East Coast, and they were here for 200 years. And there were families in Europe that way as well. Somewhere, somehow, Andrew Taylor Still learned about bone setting and incorporated that into his previous drugless practice of magnetic healing. So that spiritualism, magnetic healing, bone setting, and perhaps other disciplines that were prominent at the time formed the basis for what Still would call osteopathy. Now, the word osteopathy was coined by A.T. Still. Why? There are a lot of stories about why he used that term. The interesting thing is that in his autobiography, he says, and the quote is right here on the screen, that he flung to the breeze the banner of osteopathy in June of 1874. It's a good story to tell, but it's not true. Still never used that word until 1890. So while he may have been thinking about a system, as he indeed was, and organizing his thoughts about drugs, about the wholeness of the body, about the body's ability to heal itself, he did not use the word osteopathy until just before the founding of his school in Kirksville. As I said, he'd been read out of the Methodist congregation. They said he was imitating Jesus. He tried to talk about his, quote, as he called it, science at Baker University, which was near his home in Baldwin. The interesting thing about that story is that A.T. and his brothers had given 460 acres on which that university stood, and still stands, by the way, the first university in Kansas. The president of the university, and it was a Methodist institution, mindful that A.T. had been read out of the congregation, refused him the opportunity to speak at Baker University. And as I said earlier, magnetic healing was generally viewed as quackery. Certainly by organized medicine it was. So in 1874, with his farm on the ropes because of drought, locust attacks, and so forth, his practice basically in the toilet because of the business about magnetic healing and spiritualism, he decided to make a new start, and he went back to northern Missouri. He went back there to visit his brother Edward. Edward was the eldest. Edward had an MD degree and was in practice in Macon, Missouri, which is about 60 miles south of Kirksville. When he got there, Andrew found out that his brother James, who also had an MD degree, him from Rush, James was in Eudora, Kansas, a few miles northeast of Baldwin, where A.T. had been living. James had written a letter to brother Edward and said, you know, Drew is coming back to Missouri. Whatever you do, don't let him practice with you. He's crazy. It was 20 years before Andrew would talk to him again. By the way, Edward said, well, I wish more people were crazy then, because he certainly has a touch of healing. Eventually, he would become enormously successful and famous. But he started out as an itinerant healer, carrying around a bag of bones. There's a pretty famous osteopathic set piece where he's got his pants tucked in his boots, he's wearing a slouch hat, and he's got a bag of bones over his shoulder, and he's walking down the road in northern Missouri. And he did do that sometimes in the early portion of his practice before he made enough money for car fare. But then what he would do is he'd go somewhere in Missouri and he'd practice there for 3 or 4 weeks, and then he would go back to Kirksville for a time, and then he would go somewhere else. Naturally, a character like that is going to become well known. And in fact, he did. Eventually, he even became famous, as I said. Here he is, his card anyway, from around 1885. Dr. A.T. Still, Lightning Bone Setter, Kirksville, Missouri. Notice it does not say A.T. Still, M.D., and it does not say A.T. Still, D.O., nor does it say A.T. Still, M.D., D.O., which is what the AOA puts out. Here's the problem. He didn't have those degrees. I don't know why the AOA does that, American Osteopathic Association, but I promise you they're dead wrong. He never had an MD degree. He did call himself DO a couple of times before he started the ASO, the American School of Osteopathy. But he never used either of those sets of letters in his practice. He founded this American School of Osteopathy in 1892. There were 11 or 12 students in the first class. When it started, half of them were his children. Herman, Harry, Charlie, Fred, and Blanche. Herman and Harry were twins. Charlie was the eldest. Fred was the youngest boy, and Blanche was younger than all of them. Summerfield Still, who's a nephew, came to school there in 1894 and finished in 95. Ella, who was his wife, started a year after him and finished a year later. In 1895, when Summerfield graduated, the American School had to reorganize their curriculum. It's a little beyond what we're talking about here, but let me just say that what happened was this. Excuse me. When Still began his school, he had a very limited curriculum. Basically anatomy and, quote, osteopathy. He only taught a 5 or 6 month term, and at the end of that term, he gave the people who had attended a diploma in osteopathy. They became diplomates of osteopathy. But the problem was that there were the allopathic profession, the MDs, were trying to prevent the DOs from competing. And they tried a number of different things. And finally, they had persuaded the governor of Missouri that they were on the right track, because the Missouri legislature had passed an Independent Practice Act for the DOs. It had passed with minimal opposition in their legislature, only to be vetoed by the governor, who said that they didn't have enough scientific background, enough science curriculum. And he was right and still knew it. And so they had to reorganize. Summerfield finished in 1895 and was immediately hired to teach anatomy. Ella finished in 96. So that brings us up to 1897 and Judge Conger, whom I told you about when we started in the beginning. Judge Conger, also known as Colonel Conger, took the train to Kirksville. He was met at the station because they had telegraphed ahead. He was met by A.T. and his assistant, H.E. Patterson. And he said to Andrew Taylor Still, "The doctors in Boston tell me that I have a blood clot in my brain. Will you open up my head and scrape it out?" And Still sort of laughed at him and said, No, that's not osteopathy. But he would give him a series of treatments intended to improve the blood flow and to assist him in recovery. He took him on as a patient then, as he had done with many other people. And accounts vary, but within a short period of time, the paralysis began to clear under Still's treatment. Whether Conger recovered completely or not is just not known. It certainly sounds as if he made a near complete recovery, however, from a paralytic stroke, which is unusual. In any event, Conger was duly impressed. He had already been to Kirksville once before and had seen what was happening there, hence his return trip when he was in need of medical assistance. Conger was a smart businessman. He had been an organizing colonel of the Ohio Volunteers during the Civil War. He had come back to great adulation. He had become a member of the Republican National Committee, which meant that he had nationwide connections. He had become a prominent businessman in Akron, quite wealthy as a matter of fact, and also a judge. So this is a solid citizen who happened to fetch up in northern Missouri. He spoke with A.T. Still and he said, "I'd like to buy this school." And A.T. Still laughed at him and said, well, it wasn't for sale. He wasn't going to sell the American School of Osteopathy. Conger, though, was determined. And so he began to search around to see what he could do about starting his own school of osteopathy. How would he get that done? And where would this school potentially go? At that same time, 1890 to 1900, Des Moines was in a ferment of growth here. This was a dynamic and forward-looking community of about 65,000 people. Considering that Iowa had only been a state for 45 years, that's pretty amazing. There were 5 railways here providing daily service. There were electricity, telephones, streetcars, theaters. Higher education was here already. Drake University had been founded in 1881, and in 1884 had a medical school founded as well. Des Moines had been only about a land area of around 8 or 9 square miles until 1890, when it annexed a whole lot of the surrounding territory and suddenly became 55 square miles in size, considerably larger. And because of the forward, progressive nature of the people who were working here at the time, they had actively sought to bring osteopathy here. They had asked A.T. Still to come up from Kirksville, and they promised him land where currently the fairgrounds are, and offered to have him bring the American school to Des Moines. There were people in Still's family who wanted to do that too, because Des Moines, 65,000, maybe 4 or 5 times the size of Kirksville, considerably more cosmopolitan city, and clearly a city that was committed, evidence Drake University, to higher education. Here's Des Moines, East 5th and Locust in 1885, and you can see that even a few years before, Des Moines was a fairly cosmopolitan city. It's interesting, I don't know whether you can see it or not, the horse on the curbside is blindfolded, probably so he wouldn't run or something. And here's Des Moines. This is Locust looking east from this side of the river. This is around 1905, about 20 years after the last photo. Notice how the big buildings, the traffic, the people. Des Moines was a really vital, thriving place. And here's the original Drake University building. It's still over there at the campus. This was photographed in 1914, of course. So Des Moines was a place that was just waiting, it seemed, for osteopathic education. DOs were already here before the Stills founded their school. The first permanent DO in Iowa was an ASO grad, was in the class with Summerfield. His name was Charles Hartopy. He had an office in downtown Des Moines, and a couple of years after he got here, he was joined by his brother William. They used to advertise regularly in the Des Moines papers of the time. You can look at old copies of the Register, the Des Moines Leader, and others, and many of these, on the front page, there will be a box. They used to put advertising on the front page of newspapers in those days. The advertising on the front page, up in the upper right corner, where it's very prominent, big letters, Osteopathy. You want it? We've got it. Charles Hartopy, and gave his address. Hartopy was well known to A.T. Still as well. The problem was that there was no Independent Practice Act in Iowa for DOs. But in March of 1898, the Iowa legislature approved what was called in those days the Osteopathic Bill. They approved it by 1 vote. That's how close it was. And they were bitterly, bitterly opposed by the Iowa Medical Society. 9 months later, Summerfield Still opens the SS Still College and Infirmary of Osteopathy in September 1898. By 1900, then, there were 5 medical schools in Iowa. The University of Iowa had the one in Iowa City, but they also had the Keokuk College of Physicians and Surgeons, which was the first medical school in Iowa. Drake had their College of Medicine. It was downtown. It wasn't over here at the Drake campus. There was a private school, Sioux City College, which closed in 1908, and the Still College. But by 1913, only the Still College and the University of Iowa remained. All the others merged or closed. So the founders then, A.L. Conger, I've already mentioned. He and his son each had a share in the initial stock of the Still College. Summerfield S. Still, and Ella each had a share. A fellow named William W.G. Helm had a share. A DO who also had an MD degree named Carl McConnell was initially in the first group, but opted out and remained in Kirksville. And he sold his shares to Wilfred Riggs. So I think you can see there were 4 Kirksville faculty, or at least people with connection to Kirksville, and then Conger and his son. There were 6 initial investors. The initial investment was $18,000. And it doesn't sound like a lot of money today until I tell you that each individual share was $3,000, which is about 6 or 7 times the annual salary of a working man at that time. So it was a fairly large amount of money. The question is, where did SS and Ella get that money? Here's the thing. SS had been, he didn't start school there till he was 40-something. He had been occupied with other work up until that time. He went to Baker University, the same place that wouldn't let AT talk. He went to Baker University and then later may have attended briefly University of Kansas. But he spent most of his life as a haberdasher. He sold men's clothing in Maryville, Missouri for about, 15 years or so. Well, here's Colonel Conger. He was a colonel of the 104th and 115th Ohio Infantry Regiments, and later on a judge, a Republican National Committeeman, all the things that I said. I think without question that Arthur Conger was the driving force behind the founding of this school. This school would not have been founded without his desire to see osteopathic education elsewhere than Kirksville. It's tempting to be a cynic and say he saw a main business chance here. There was already an osteopathic school in Minneapolis. There was one in Denver. There was one in Fargo, North Dakota. There was the Kirksville School. There was talk of a school being formed in Chicago. Schools were being formed left and right, all over the place. In fact, by 1910 or so, the profession had 4,000 members, but only 2,000 of them had been educated in Kirksville. All the others had been educated in the new schools that had been formed. My guess is that Conger was the money man and put up the funds to start the school, and that Summerfield and Ella were given shares because he was the president and was the founder, and his name, not coincidentally, was still a famous name by that time. So I think A.L. Conger was the guy who started the ball rolling. Notice one other thing. He had his paralytic stroke in 1897. They moved here to Des Moines in 1898 and opened the college, and he died in 1899 of a stroke. So he didn't live very long after the founding of the school. But he was, I think, the driving force. Summerfield Saunders Still, here he is at about age 20. Went to school at Baker University until 1878. Taught school for a while in Eudora, Kansas, which is where his father James was in practice. James, recall, was the brother of A.T. Still, who wrote to the other brother and said, don't let him practice with you, he's crazy. Summerfield's father and A.T. were not on speaking terms. In any event, he had his haberdashery in Maryville, Missouri until around 1894, and he entered the class that year at ASO under his uncle and got his diploma in osteopathy in 1895. He was immediately hired. I mean, literally, he must have walked off the stage and been given a book or something, because he was literally hired to teach anatomy as soon as he graduated. This was exceptionally important. And the reason it was important is this. Anatomy in the mid-19th century was the science of medicine. Physiology, which we all today think of as sort of the queen science, we deal with how things work normally and how do they go off the track, pathophysiology and all of that. But in those days, physiology was a relatively new science, maybe 50 years old, whereas anatomy had been around for 2,000 years, Galen in the Roman era, and before that even. And A.T. Still's entire theory of healing was based on anatomy, not physiology. Disordered anatomy resulted in disease. The first anatomy teacher at the ASO had been William Smith, an MD who had seen promise in osteopathic theory and treatments, and who eventually got a DO degree from Still. He's often called the first DO, William Smith. He taught them anatomy. But after he finished his DO requirement there, he left to enter private practice. A woman in the first class graduated. Her name was Nettie Bowles, B-O-L-L-E-S, the first female DO, ladies, Nettie Bowles. Nettie graduated and Still, so the story goes, handed her a copy of Gray's Anatomy and said, "You're the anatomy professor. Do your best." Whew. Which I guess she did, except she left within a year or two to found an osteopathic school of her own in Denver. At that point, A.T. hired his nephew, Summerfield, to teach anatomy there at the ASO. Before he taught it, though, he sent him to Chicago to work with a world-famous anatomist for a while until he learned as much of it as he could. There's a quote from A.T. Still in the history of this college lauding how good Summerfield was and that he was the best anatomist that he had ever met. He could say that without any fear of contradiction because he had never met an anatomist. Okay? An anatomist would have been someone who had extended study in the field of anatomy, yes? Generally given by someone, not autodidact or self-taught. Still was self-taught. He might have called himself an anatomist, but he didn't have a credential. William Smith was an MD, but he was certainly not an anatomist. He was a physician who had been in practice. Nettie Bowles, obviously not an anatomist. She just graduated from DO school, and neither was Summerfield. Further, that quote, which says that he was the best anatomist that he had ever met, that quote's undated. My guess is that quote comes from before Summerfield came here to found this school. Because A.T. and his sons deeply resented Summerfield's leaving. Ella, Summerfield's wife, was born in Maine but lived most of her life in eastern Kansas, where they met. She and SS were married in 1878, had 2 children, George and Delia. She was also an ASO student, as I said. And then after she finished, she went to Chicago and studied obstetrics with a group of surgeons. See, there were no residencies at that time. You learned by apprenticeship with someone who knew the ropes, who knew how to do things. And so she finished school and decided she wanted to do obstetrics. Went there and spent I don't know how long with this group of surgeons. She later specialized in gynecology, taught here at the Summerfield S. Still College and Infirmary of Osteopathy, and was also, through the rest of her life, active in women's rights and in osteopathic rights. When she and Summerfield were here, you heard mentioned earlier today that she was considered, and so was he, sort of paternalistic, sort of the parents of everybody. They were very, very well liked, and she in particular was well liked because of her dedication to women. Her name, by the way, was not Ella. It was Rosella. On her birth certificate, it's Rosella, not Ella, but it was shortened, and she never used Rosella. And nobody called her Ella much after they were here. Everybody called her Mother. Mother Still. She even signed her letters Mother, or sometimes Mo, M-O. Rosella, or Ella Still, who deserves a great deal of credit along with her husband. And here they are. Summerfield on the left. This is around the time, his photo is from around the time of the founding of the SS Still College and Infirmary. Her photo was from some years later. She's probably in her 50s at that time. This photo of her is probably after they went back to Kirksville a few years later. Here's the original SS Still College, the original building. This was purchased by Conger. Conger lived here for a while on one side while they conducted classes on the other. And later it was remodeled and became the college infirmary. This particular building stood at 1429 Locust here in Des Moines. Anybody know where that is? Yeah, it's the sculpture garden now. In fact, if you drive down Locust and you look left as you drive by, there's a bundle of pickup sticks there that they call a sculpture that's made out of orange I-beams. It's right across from that I-beams. It's a vacant lot now. The Laura Cocina restaurant is on some of that property as well. Within a year, they had built a permanent school. The first years then, the first class of about 40 entered the Still College in September of 1898. Unlike the ASO, which had begun with one term of 5 months and gradually expanded to 4 terms of 6 months or 5 months, I've forgotten which, this school began with 2 annual terms, with a 2-year requirement, and with a wide curriculum that was similar to the curriculum that had been instituted in Kirksville in order to have the wider Practice Act and to receive a charter as a school. It omitted materia medica. Materia medica is just an old term for pharmacology. They didn't teach drugs. They didn't hold with any drugs in osteopathic education. The original tuition was $500. About the annual income of a worker. They later reduced that to around $350, I think, primarily because people couldn't afford it. The tuition in Kirksville was $500 after all, and that was the Mecca. That was where the old doctor was. I mean, if I'm going to spend $500, I'm going to Kirksville, is probably what people said. Okay. The admission requirement at that time was a high school diploma. And here's an early advertisement. 2 classes were admitted per year in the Still College, and that persisted until the 1950s, folks. They had a summer or spring class and a mid-year class every year. There were 2 graduating classes every year. I don't know how well you can read it, but if you look, there are very few names up there that are not followed by DO. Also, there's a lot of still names there. Well, as I said, AT resented bitterly competing schools. He probably felt that SS was ungrateful in deserting him and going off to form a competing school of his own. AT wrote that year in the summer, July, in the Journal of Osteopathy that schools, quote, may be started by students, patients, and others who, having for a time been near a school, think they have imbibed all the knowledge of osteopathy. The implication being, you guys don't know jack, okay? Just because you can start a school doesn't mean you know anything. Well, Conger, who was the secretary of the school, and who had started a publication called, wait for it, Cosmopolitan Osteopath, implying that Des Moines was a much more cosmopolitan place than Kirksville, wrote that Kirksville was a hotbed of typhoid and malarial fever. You don't want to go there. By 1899, they had built this building on Locust, 1428 West Locust. This is on the south side of Locust, facing the sculpture garden it was. And if you look very carefully, see the frame house here to the left, that was where Summerfield and Ella lived until 1905 when the college changed hands. So they lived literally next door. And so you can see how they could have been present in the lives of their students almost continuously. It's no wonder they were considered the parents of the school. Originally, there were going to be two wings like this. The other would have been off to the left of this picture, connected by a middle wing with a big dome over it. But it never got past that building. Well, many new schools of osteopathy, and for that matter, allopathic schools as well, tended to suffer during their beginnings because of lean times, because of undercapitalization, all sorts of things. The college, the SS Still College and Infirmary, was sold in 1903, sort of under the table, to Charlie Still, A.T.'s eldest son. The plan was to move the school and merge it with the Kirksville School, with the ASO. By 1904, though, that got out. The student body rebelled and said, "No, I don't care if you want to move or do whatever you want. We'll just start our own school here. We have plenty of help, and we're going to do that." Charlie Still, always known as Dr. Charlie during his lifetime, Dr. Charlie came up from Kirksville to address the student body and said, no, they weren't planning to close the school or move it or anything else. He lied. They were. But recognizing the kind of trouble that was going to happen, Charlie turned around and sold his stock in this school to the board of directors of the ASO. He owned it individually. Now the Kirksville School owned it. Well, in 1905, what happened was a group of local public-spirited businessmen from Des Moines got together and bought the assets. What they did, and this happened again a few years after this, what happened was this. The school was in trouble. They didn't have money. They closed. The school actually closed. It didn't shut down operations, but it did close. And what happens when you look at articles of incorporation, those of you who have done that, almost all of them have a clause that provides for dissolution of the corporation. And that's what happened. The school's corporation was dissolved, and a new corporation was instituted that took its place. This was formed by Frederick Hubble, not the Frederick Hubble founder, but Frederick Hubble founder's son, Frederick C. Hubble, as well as a group of other businessmen. So they effectively saved the school for Des Moines by doing that. They made it a nonprofit, which it had not been up to that point, and it was renamed Still College of Osteopathy instead of that long moniker that it had there for those 7 or 8 years. Summerfield and Ella became employees in 1905 and eventually entered private practice and stayed here in Des Moines until 1913. They moved from the frame house next door to the school to a house 17-something 9th Avenue here in Des Moines. And we're in private practice. SS went to law school. He went to law school at Drake and got a Doctor of Laws, an LLD degree. He never practiced or used it, but certainly many of us have used that particular accomplishment of his to argue that he was a lifelong student, a lifelong learner, someone who was committed to education. In 1913, they moved back to Kirksville, and he taught and practiced there, and so did Ella. Their son George had already gone to Kirksville a few years before that, and by the time that SS got there, George, his eldest son, was the chief of surgery at the Kirksville School at ASO. A little bit about osteopathic education at that time. Between 1896 and 1899, there were 13 legitimate schools of osteopathy that were founded in that 3-year period. Places like Kansas City, Los Angeles, Boston, Philadelphia, Denver, and others. And there were a few that were diploma mills and were put together by fake DOs. the National School of Osteopathy in Kansas City, which was up and running at that time. And I think the guy who started it was a guy named Barber. Barber claimed to be the discoverer of osteopathy, the only true osteopathy, and that they taught everything, including medication, which really made Still mad. And, you know, you could come there for less money than you could go to Des Moines or Denver or Kirksville or wherever. An investigator went to him, Barber, and said, geez, you know, I don't have time to go to all those classes. And Barber sort of intimated, well, if you pay me the tuition, I can issue you a diploma. In other words, a diploma mill. Somehow or other, he got away with it. They were never closed for that. Many allopathic and osteopathic schools closed after the Flexner report. Some of you may know about that, and I don't have time here to talk about it, but the Flexner report was a survey of all of the osteopathic and allopathic schools in the United States. Out of all those schools, and we're talking 175 maybe MD schools and however many DO schools there were by then, he only approved of 2 schools. 2. Johns Hopkins and the University of Michigan. He said that the Still College, this one, was a disgrace and should be summarily suppressed. Well, so many colleges of medicine took it in the shorts over all of the things that Flexner said that many of them either closed or merged or whatever. By the end of the fallout from the Flexner report, there were only 6 colleges of osteopathic medicine left. At the same time, this school had already absorbed 2. The Northern School, which had been started in Minneapolis, and the Northwest School, which was in Fargo, North Dakota. Both of those in 1902, before the college was sold. These new colleges now were the influence that widened the profession. New colleges of osteopathy exerted great pressure to widen the curriculum, to make it include obstetrics, major surgery, and materia medica, which still just made him go off like a Roman candle. What happened then was that A.T. Still and family lost control of the profession. As the schools began to proliferate, as the curriculum began to expand what he had originally envisioned, Still suddenly found himself looking at a profession that he didn't really know anymore. The American Association for the Advancement of Osteopathy, now known as the American Osteopathic Association, had been established there at the very end of the 19th century, and a subcommittee, the Associated Colleges of Osteopathy, began to try to standardize osteopathic curricula, including adding obstetrics, major surgery, excuse me, and making requirements about teaching of various kinds of drugs. In 1902, when they did that, the Kirksville School dropped out of the Associated Colleges of Osteopathy and did not attend another meeting until 1920. But it didn't matter, because all the other colleges began to fall into line. Research into the, quote, osteopathic lesion began. Change from osteopathy to osteopathic medicine began at that time. Still spent a great deal of time trying to persuade people, and he strongly, fully believed it, that osteopathy was not medicine. That was one of the things that they harped on when they were trying to get practice acts. We're not practicing medicine without a license. We're practicing osteopathy. This is not medicine. And yet, a few years after the founding of ASO, Still himself and others began to call osteopathy one of the healing arts that fell under the broad category of medicine. The scope of practice controversy I mentioned, there was a group who were in favor of what's called broad osteopathy, led partly by J. Martin Littlejohn of Chicago, as well as DO surgeons and obstetricians who had been left out, you see, of osteopathy by AT. James Littlejohn, who was J. Martin's brother, who had an MD degree from a Michigan school, added, and he was a gynecologist, added that gynecologic cases where people were injured, where there was purulence, and that sort of thing couldn't be treated with manipulation. You couldn't do that. You know, sometimes you had to do surgery. George Still, whom I mentioned already, who was by that time in Kirksville at ASO, chastised DOs in print who manipulated the spine of people who had Pott's disease. Students, you know what Pott's disease is? Some of you do. It's tuberculosis of the spine. It's an infection. You cannot manipulate it away. And George, said that in no uncertain terms. And so broad osteopathy eventually would win out, and drugless osteopathy actually vanished by 1930. A few more who helped widen the profession. Simeon L. Taylor, MD, DO, was president of the Still College from 1911 until 1926. He was a graduate of the University of Nebraska College of Medicine and also of the Still College. He was one of the strong leaders in the call for broader osteopathy. He had done his surgery training under William Halsted at Johns Hopkins. He was exceptionally well trained. Halsted, by the way, for those of you who don't know, is the guy who devised the radical mastectomy for cancer. Simeon Taylor left here in 1926, but not before his enormous influence had been felt. And here's George, SS and Ella's son George, looking pretty dapper here, I have to say. George graduated from Drake with a bachelor's degree, got an MD degree from Northwestern in Chicago, and came back here and taught for a while until about 1907 when he moved to Kirksville and got his DO degree. He didn't get it from this school. He later became president of the American School of Osteopathy in 1918. It's a long story, and we don't have time for me to tell it to you, except to say that Charlie Still, the old doctor's eldest son, who was vice president of the ASO, thought he was in line to become president. The old doctor died in December of 1917. At the very next board meeting, the board fired Dr. Charlie and put George in as president, which must have just galled Charlie no end. They were cousins, you see, and they didn't like each other. And George took over. George died 2 years later, and Summerfield became president of the ASO for a couple of years. By then, he was 70-something. By the way, what happened to George is, I have to tell you, he was at a Christmas party at his house and was showing off a new pistol that he bought. He dropped it, it went off and killed him at the party. So the scope of practice changed. The lesion osteopaths and the broad osteopaths fought with each other over the breadth of the practice in the profession. The broad osteopaths thought, not unreasonably, that all therapeutic modalities ought to be used by DOs. Manipulation, surgery, obstetrics, drugs, whatever. The lesion osteopaths, in concert with A.T. Still, Charlie Still, Dr. Charlie I mentioned, always argued against adding from allopathic medicine to osteopathy. Antitoxins, serums, chemicals, botanicals were all coming into use at that time and had been shown efficacious. Still, and others continued to oppose that. And yet, even non-surgeons argued for widening of practice. Dane Tasker, who's quite well known in osteopathic history circles, he was at the Pacific College in 1902, said in the Journal of Osteopathy, "To be truly scientific, we," meaning the DOs, "must love truth better than preconceived ideas. In other words, open your mind and pay attention to these new therapeutic modalities. The evidence for newer drugs continued to accumulate, but despite mounting evidence in 1915, A.T., who by then was 87, his last plea against drug therapies was, and students know I've used this before, they've heard it, keep it pure, boys, keep it pure. But he was unsuccessful. The influenza pandemic in 18 gave some support to lesion osteopaths who said that they treated people with flu by manipulation and their patients did better. Well, maybe. In any event, osteopathic acts, wider practice rights for DOs, these triggered an allopathic backlash. Around the time of World War I, a plan by the American College of Surgeons called Standardization of Hospitals was passed and then was joined by the AMA. One of the specific clauses of that standardization barred hospitals that taught MDs from having DOs on their staff. The idea, of course, being to kill the DO competition. Osteopathy training programs were lost in these allopathic institutions. Osteopathy was labeled a cult by the AMA. And so osteopathic hospitals became a necessity. Another story in the history of the profession, but osteopathic hospitals became a necessity, direct result of the 1918 Standardization of Hospitals plan by the American College of Surgeons. So, the profession widened its education, widened its practice rights, tried to move into allopathic hospitals and were barred and had to make their own. And so, from this ashes of all this and all that change, osteopathy eventually became osteopathic medicine. So that Summerfield and Ella and the founders of this school, along with founders of other new schools, especially those who were the most reputable, the most academic, are the ones that are the reason why DOs have the wide practice rights that we do today. There are just a few notes and an appreciation. I'm grateful to all these folks who helped me as I put this together. It's about 2 minutes after 6. If anybody has any questions, here I am. Yes, ma'am.
Wasn't the SS Gill College that was the first to award the Doctor of Osteopathy degree rather than
the diploma? Maybe. It's been said that this school was the first one to call it the Doctor of Osteopathy. What I know about that is not a lot, but here's what I can tell you. The original degree was a diploma in osteopathy. In fact, the original degree for the people that were either apprenticed to Still, he had a few apprentices before he started the school, including William Smith, the MD I talked to you about. He wrote out their diplomas by hand and gave them to them. And then a few years later, they got some printed up and gave to them. And for at least until 1896, maybe 1898, they were still awarding a diploma in osteopathy. But then the question comes up, when did they start doing the DO Doctor of Osteopathy? When did it start saying that? And I don't know for sure. It was around the time this school was formed. But whether it was just before or just after, that I can't tell you.
Well, there's something written up where Ella says it was the first, but I can't find it anywhere else.
I can't either, and I've looked for that. One other thing that I forgot to mention, and this reminded me, when I talked about the transition in 1905, one of the things that happened is before the school was reorganized, it was actually considered by the ASO as a branch of the American School of Osteopathy. Hence, diplomas from the mid-year of 1905 have A.T. Still, from here, have A.T. Still signature on them. Dr. Franklin, I think you have one of those diplomas in your office on display. If you look at it, you'll see A.T. Still signed it. That was the only session where A.T. Still signed diplomas of another school here. Way up there.
Does it strike you as strange that in the early days of this institution, it felt like there was a fair amount of traffic between here and Kirksville among still family faculty members? Does that seem strange, or was it because they, even though they had some disagreements, that they knew each other?
You know, I honestly don't know, and there's nothing that I can find. Boy, I wish I could find somebody had a journal or somebody said, you know, that guy's a schmuck, or, you know, but there isn't any of that. What I know is there was lots of animosity. There is a document that's in the National Museum in Kirksville, which is a letter written by Charlie Still. And in it, it's like 1904, he's talking about how he's going to sell all this stuff and the sum of money it was going to be and all these things. And then at the very last, there's a short paragraph that says something to the effect that he spoke with S.S. Still about this school here, but didn't have anything more to say because, and this is a quote, "I'm tired of his filth." Yeah, filth. I'm not sure what the filth was, but it was pretty clear that Charlie had extreme animosity toward Summerfield. It's funny, too, that his son George went down to Kirksville and later became chief of surgery there. But here's the thing. He went down there to go to school instead of coming here. So he probably was in good graces with the old man, with the old doctor. Meantime, Summerfield was still here, and Ella. So I think there were pockets of familial conflict, shall we call it. Don't forget, Summerfield's father said that A.T. was crazy, too. And yet, and here's another little side story for you. James Moore Still was his name, who practiced in Eudora, Kansas, decided in like 1895 that maybe he ought to learn about being a DO too, and he wrote to his brother and came to Kirksville to get his DO degree also. So it took almost 20 years, but they finally, that falling out got repaired. I don't know, you know, blood's thicker than water, I guess, is about the only answer I can give you as a kind of a flippant one, but I think that's probably true. Yes, ma'am. George had 2 or 3 children. I don't know much about them. I haven't looked into it. But yeah, George and his wife's name was Ardella had, I think, 2 children. Yes, ma'am.
There's a long history in the osteopathic profession of sending doctors to the places they're needed most where there are not enough doctors. Can you say that that started at a particular time in the school's history?
Yeah, that particular stratagem began even before, no, it began right after the founding of the ASO. There's a really pretty good story about how Charlie went up to Red Wing, Minnesota to practice. And this was one of these temporary deals. It was, I think, probably patterned on A.T.'s itinerant healing practice from the 1880s. Well, Charlie went up, and Charlie already had his DO because he was in the first class. He went up to Red Wing to open an office, and he took along with him a student from there named Charles Hardapee. Charles Hardapee, I mentioned a while ago, was the first DO to practice permanently in Iowa. In point of fact, A.T. liked him, Charles, and wrote at the time, I didn't mention this before, but he wrote at the time of the founding of the S.S. Still College and Infirmary of Osteopathy, he wrote in the Journal of Osteopathy that He didn't know why they were founding a school in Iowa. There were already a lot of DOs in Iowa. There were 2 DOs that he knew very well in Des Moines who were excellent practitioners. He was talking about the Hardipee brothers, who were excellent practitioners and minded their own business. That is to say, didn't start competing schools. Okay. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any indication as to the reason that SS and Ella joined with Colonel Conger? By all accounts, SS was popular with AT.
He was.
What would have led them to say, we're going to cast out and go to Des Moines? I mean, was money? I mean, they didn't seem like they were money hungry.
No, they didn't. To be honest, I don't know. The cynic in me says the answer is a single word: money. And it certainly would be possible that it could be that, given if what I said is true, and it's nothing but speculation on my part, that Conger was the money man and he had all the money. But Conger was nationally known. He was independently wealthy. Summerfield and Ella may have had some money of their own. They had been in business for years before going to ASO. But there's no evidence of that. There's no evidence where that money came from. But I continue to think that Conger, who was a well-known, very successful businessman, very likely dangled the little carrot of, we're going to make a lot of money doing this, in front of them. But is that how it happened? I don't think anyone knows. If they do, they took it to the grave. Yes, sir?
My question would be, of the list of doctors or stills or other names, did they all practice manipulation?
In those days, the answer is yes. In those days, they all practiced manipulation.
And did AT teach them this harmonic thing?
Oh, the business, the grand harmonia, that thing.
I can't grasp how putting somebody on a table and take a hold of them and say, yeah, you're unbalanced. I can fix that.
It's to be truthful, I honestly, they all did manipulation in those days. For example, SS taught anatomy and osteopathic medicine by that manipulation. They didn't teach major surgery. They did teach obstetrics. They taught minor surgery. But even if you did, I suppose, obstetrics, I'm certain that they did manipulative therapy as well. That began to change as the practice scope widened, and the use of osteopathic manipulative therapy just trickled down.
Well, because sometime back, while I did a lot of reading about health and natural things, I came across a book by Dr. Andrew Weil. Dr. Andrew Weil got his degree, then proceeded to travel the whole world studying different medical persuasions.
Yeah.
And when he was in Phoenix, over the back fence, a neighbor who had retired from osteopathy in Connecticut and had moved out there to retire, people kept coming to him and saying, I got this little ache, and the guys just started helping him. And in the book, Dr. Weil quotes this school and the folks that were taught here. And that doctor was evidently taught here. And what impressed Dr. Weil was, here was a man who came to him who had an entire lifelong diarrhea problem. This practitioner put him on a table in his kitchen, I guess, checked him out, said, yeah, you're just a little unbalanced. Fixed it, and the guy goes home, never to have problems with diarrhea again. Which says, did he learn that in Des Moines?
Well,
Did he learn that at this school? Are those kinds of things still a mystery, or are they being taught?
I don't see anybody from the OMM department, so I can't answer it that with them. I can say that in the very beginning, probably what A.T. Still was doing was mostly orthopedic work. People had, and there are orthopedic problems that still crop up today. A thing called frozen shoulder, for example, where you can't really move, or dislocation of a hip, or, fractures, those kinds of things. And it seems pretty clear that when Still was a lightning bone setter, that's what he was doing. He was setting fractures, reducing dislocations, etc. But it's also told in some of the books that as he was studying people who had a certain complaint, one of the things that he would do was to feel their spinal processes and so forth. And many times he recorded, although none of this is scientifically recorded or anything, he recorded areas of heat or areas of tenderness or areas of muscle contraction. And he began to relate these, so the story goes, in his mind to the particular complaint that somebody had that wasn't an orthopedic complaint. Maybe it was asthma, or maybe it was diarrhea or something else. Excuse me. There is, in osteopathic philosophy, a thing called trigger points. There's a book, and I can't think of the name of it, by a fellow who studied Chapman's Reflexes is the name of that book, who studied, you guys know about that book, students? Do you know about that book? Did you have to learn that? You have a test on it on Wednesday, okay. Well, then, I don't have the cheat sheet, I can't help you there. But Chapman's reflexes were said, and still are said, to reflect somatization, or a muscle or musculoskeletal evidence of a visceral or an internal disorder. Now, the old EOs, some of them really subscribe to that stuff. I was taught that in school too, by the way, students. I have a copy of that book somewhere at home. But was that taught after World War II? I don't think so. It was taught to me, but never as, well, if you find this, then you go treat this, and that takes care of that, and here we go. So I don't know. I wish I could answer your question more fully. All I can say is that there is evidence out there that people have studied for what's called a visceral somatic reflex, or a Chapman's reflex, which suggests that if you have a bad stomach, for example, students, where do they find it if your stomach's bad? Where? T5 through 9 on the right or left? See, so they're taught this in school today. I was taught, for example, heart disease. Was it T6 through 9 on the left? Something like that. So, was it taught? Yes. Is it taught now? Yes. Do they use it? I don't know.
But it just seems like they got such a broad education here that allowed them
to do those things.
Heal someone, though that wasn't in chapter such and such.
Yeah.
They had a greater capacity to understand illness in the body, whether it's a skeleton or just what it was.
Yeah. Let me get your question, and then I'll.
Between everybody else and dinner, but you mentioned that A.T. traveled around with a bag of bones.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, he used to use those to demonstrate. He had a bag of loose bones, and he would take out a femur, and he would say, now this is where this muscle attaches here, and this muscle attaches here, but if this muscle's weak, this one, and then he would demonstrate. Sometimes he would come into a town with his bag of bones, and there'd be a wagon on the town square. He'd jump up in the bed of the wagon and start yelling for everybody to come listen to him. And so they would all want over there, he's medicine man, selling patent medicine, and what's he doing. And then he would say, one of you out there that has a problem, come here and let me see. And then he would get up there and he'd fix it. And so then they would start lining up, Still knew how to do this. Now, the thing about it was, and remains, I think, and this is something, students, that you need to think about as well. What's the secret? What's the real secret? Touching people. Touching people. The secret in medicine, not just osteopathic medicine, but in medicine in general, has always been touch. Always. Always. We know, too, that a third of people, you give them a drug and they'll get better even if it didn't have any effect. It's called the placebo effect. Does the placebo effect extend to other therapies? You bet it does. Was some of this placebo that still did and some of them? Maybe. Some of it was doubtless really therapeutic. Some of it was placebo effect. And they didn't all get better. They couldn't. Even though the exaggeration and the hagiography, you know that word? A hagiography is a life of a saint. Okay? All of A.T. Still, just about all of his biographies are hagiography, life of a saint. They tend to be exaggerated. These guys walk on water and leap tall buildings at a single bound and all these things. And so still comes off as a much, much, much more effective healer than maybe he really was. We just don't know. Well, at 6:20...
This is why doing our history is so fascinating, and we can ask for a better resource than Dr. Huff. So thank you, Dr. Huff.